Hello world, this is CS50 Live. My name is David Malan and we're here to review your code today. So CS50's own Andrew and Colton are secretly sitting off camera here just in case I break anything since I'm on my own today, I'm told. But thanks so much for all of your submissions of code via the Google form. Glad to see so many people and so many familiar names in the Twitch stream. Feel free to tune in via Discourse or our other channels and we're ready to go today. So the goal at hand is to provide some feedback on code, realize that reasonable people will disagree, including you with me, so by all means don't take everything I say as gospel, but I'll at least give you my own perspective based on my own experience on what you could do differently or better in your particular code, perhaps when it comes to design or style especially. All right, so feel free to chat along in the chat window here, ask questions as we go, but here we are. So thanks to Salt Eric, I think we called him some time ago, we have a submission of an HTML-based code here, a little something reminiscent of Zelda with a little bit of ipsum, lorem ipsum style, a la Latin. So let's dive right in. Here, Eric has said that he made this because he was bored. That's a perfectly valid reason, I suppose, to write some code. So let's see what he wrote. Now here are 5 files: a README, a TrueType file, and a CSS file, an HTML file, and a JavaScript file. So as before, where do you begin? Well, my eyes might gravitate initially to the README, but we plucked that one off already. So how about we take a look at index.html instead as really the entry point to anything that's very web-based. And Gersamar03, yes, we do have a Discord server, and the true Canis has kindly pasted the URL there too for us. So here is index.html. Let's go ahead and take a look here at what Eric has done and see if we can't wrap our mind around what's going on here and ultimately what we might do differently. And hello to Babak Knight. So of course every web page has a head section, as Eric does up here, and then a body section, as he does up here. At first glance everything looks pretty neat and everything is nicely indented and it's very readable, but I do see a few things that are perhaps worth commenting on. So let's work our way from the top to the bottom. So up here at the top, we have the doc type declaration, which indicates this is HTML5, the latest version. So that is helps us orient as to what kind of features of HTML here we might use. Now down here, I think, is the first opportunity for some feedback on line 6 and 7. What perhaps jumps out at folks here? Where might there be an opportunity to do things a little bit differently? Well, if you look at these, you'll see that Eric is using on line 7 a URL to a CDN, so Cloudflare, very popular for hosting CSS files, HTML files, JavaScript files, and the like. But he's included his own CSS above that, which is not bad in this case because, as we'll see in a moment, there's not too much CSS going on in there, but this could be a problem. In general, you might want to adopt instead a habit of having any of your CDN assets at the very top, and below those having your own custom CSS or your own custom JavaScript. But why might that be? Well, the whole point of CSS is cascading style sheets, the C in CSS. And what cascade means is that any rules that come below others can potentially cascade or override those particular directives. And so my worry here is that if there's some settings in these CSS files here, Eric's missed out on an opportunity to potentially override those settings by having his index.css file below. So I might literally just swap line 6 and 7 so that you have the ability to override those. You could, in fact, rename, as Safiba proposes, index.css to style.css, but that's completely, I would say, a personal decision because there are so few files. In this particular example, index.html, index.js, index.css. Honestly, this is a pretty good naming scheme because it makes clear to me, the viewer, what files line up. Indeed, they're all somehow interrelated. So let's take a look down below here. We see some classes in CSS, and if you've not heard of containers or had text centered before as CSS classes, odds are that's coming from this Bulma framework that Eric has used up here via the CDN. So we would have to read the documentation to know what those are doing, but thankfully they're pretty self-explanatory. Odds are he's trying to center the text here, and here he's trying to make this text size 1 as via this class here. You know, this is not a big deal and the browser's going to ignore it, but there looks like a little sloppiness here, having an errant space before the word that shouldn't really be there. And I kind of see this here and here, although here it's okay because you want to actually put these radio buttons a little to the side of these words, Navi, Beetle, and Link. But there's definitely something incorrect here. This I'm not loving. This might just be a typo, but line breaks should be an open tag or a start tag. So open bracket BR, and then either close bracket or keep the trailing slash in the tag, but at the end. This here suggests that this is close BR or stop BR, and that's actually nonsensical because line breaks are either there or not there. So I'm guessing this was a mistake, guessing that slash should be after the BR, not before the BR, but again in HTML5, you actually don't need to close tags like that anyway instead. So let's take a look down here. We see another line break, probably a typographical error, so I'd move that slash to the end of the BR. Then we have a button, which looks good. Then we have another container, which looks empty. I would probably get rid of this unless maybe it's going to be used in the JavaScript file. We'll see. And indeed, here's some mention of JavaScript. So here's maybe some food for thought. Like, why put index.js at the bottom of the file? Why not put it in the head of the section, where we do sometimes in CS50, where you might have done in some of your projects? Is this good or bad? Feel free to chime in with your thoughts. But before we answer that, let's actually take a look at index.js and see what it's actually doing and see if it indeed does matter. So I've just hit back. I'm going to go to index.js. And in here, we see a whole bunch of JavaScript code. At the top, I seem to have a few different variables, beetle text, navi text, and link text. The first of those are initialized as JavaScript arrays. Here too, just be a little careful. This is more style than anything, but this probably shouldn't be there. This maybe should or shouldn't be there. Depends on what we might be appending to this. We shall see. Here we have a get random int function. That's a nice abstraction, sort of giving us a name for functionality that we might like. And then down here, what do we have going on? Generate text. A nice comment here, queries all of the radio buttons and returns the selected values. So here we have indeed a loop that's going to go ahead and figure out which of the radio buttons is checked. I see that there's probably an opportunity to improve here. It's very minor, and in the real world, you're not going to notice the difference. But the moment you find a radio button that's checked, you might as well break out of this for loop because you probably don't need to keep checking those same radio buttons because they're supposed to, by definition, be mutually exclusive. All right, let's keep going. I get a random int, presumably between 1 and 100 or 0 and 100. Here I'm checking for the value. Good use of the identity operator. This is just good habit to get into in JavaScript, checking not just equals equals, but rather equals equals equals. It makes no functional difference here, but it checks to make sure that what you're comparing on the left not only equals the thing on the right, but is also identically typed. So both of them in this case are strings. That can matter in corner cases where you're comparing empty strings or zeros or false values or falsy values. So keep that in mind as your code perhaps. All right, let's see. So there's definitely a little bit of messiness here, but this is perhaps subjective, but maybe not. So I'm seeing no space in between the if condition and this parenthesis, no space between the same here, but I am seeing spaces after the keywords like for, so and indeed here there is no space, so just a little bit of sloppiness. Doesn't really matter, certainly to me, which one you do, but go ahead and at least be consistent, otherwise it looks like your code isn't quite ready, quite complete. And no sense in colleagues of yours or friends of yours having to get mired in some of the stylistic errors as opposed to really focusing on the code's correctness. But otherwise, I see some good structures here. It looks like there's some pretty consistent code blocks here. It looks like in each of these three conditions, we're doing a loop and checking the contents of some array. The navi text, beetle text, link text feels like there's probably an opportunity to factor this out, maybe to a function that does that, but takes as input the name of the array. So I might keep that in mind. And then down here, it's where we're putting our actual event listener. So in short, it seems like quite a bit is going on in this JavaScript file. So let's come back to that earlier question. Why might we put index.js at the bottom of our HTML file and not in the head? Well, I saw it mentioned here. Let me scroll up in our chat. Giovanni AG proposes that it's good because the JSS or JavaScript is among the most heavy files and you want to load it last, so the rest of the site loads first, he asks. Another question, another feedback here. Nope, everyone else is talking about Twitch right now, which is totally fine as well. So that's pretty spot on, Giovanni Ag. This is a convention, putting the JavaScript code at the bottom of your HTML file, because if one, the code is large, it might indeed take more than a few milliseconds to download, and that can block the rest of your web page from actually rendering on the screen. So you might see nothing initially. Your users might just see white empty boxes until the entire page and that code is loaded. So putting it at the very end means that the code is only going to be loaded at the very end after everything else that's important to you has indeed loaded. And then two, if you were to put it in the head, suppose that that file were not on my server, index.js, but like on a CDN or a third-party server, which is especially the case for things like advertisements and ad servers, that could really slow your own site down, and you might have no control over that. So even the link that we had up here using the Bulmo CSS, this one has to be there because it's CSS, and CSS links do need to go in the head of a page by definition of HTML5. But JavaScript, you can at least afford to put it later in the file and load it therefore only at the very end. So great feedback there, and I think we're in good shape here. So let's just take a look at one more file, perhaps the index.css file. And here is where we have some reassurance that, okay, probably doesn't matter the ordering of those two files in index.html because there's not terribly much custom CSS here, but indeed we see that Eric has defined a default font face using this TrueType file that is the 5th of the files in this repo, and specified that his h1 tag should have letter spacing of 5 pixels and a font family of Triforce. But in general, your CSS should probably come after any libraries that you're using, else you're just giving up control over the aesthetics unnecessarily. And indeed, so this is a code review for those of you who have just tuned in. We've solicited code from folks via cs50.ly/code review. We just took a look at the first example from NACL Eric on GitHub here. We have a few more that we're going to take a look at. And indeed, this is streaming on Twitch, on YouTube, and on Facebook. So feel free to chat with each other and chat with us via any of those mechanisms if you're watching live. So let's go ahead here, and let me see if I can't draw your attention to the code in question. All of these are public repos by definition, so if you'd like to go ahead here, and perhaps Colton off camera can paste the URL of this current repo into the chat, absolutely, the true Kinese, we can go ahead and show that to you. All right, so here we go. Oh, and userman 2, I see that you have heard that there is lazy loading libraries for JavaScript. So that's indeed the case too. You can use a third-party library that will actually go fetch, as via Ajax, your JavaScript code and inject it into the document in the appropriate place. That too addresses this issue and gives you more flexibility if you don't have complete control over where the tags are actually going in your web page. So thank you to Colton, who's logged in here at CS50 TV, for the URL of that first repo. And thank you to Eric for contributing. All right, so let's forge ahead. And this one, I think you'll find, is a bit of a throwback. Years ago, CS50, our introductory course, used to use PHP at the tail end for our look at web programming. These days we use Python, but this brought back some memories for sure, because for quite a few years did we use PHP, which is still a very popular language for web programming. In answer to your question, the Mr. Distinguished, if you submit your code now, will we get to it? Probably not today, just because we have quite a bit of interest from other folks that have submitted already, but do still submit, and we'll weave it into a future stream as well, we hope. So for those unfamiliar or less familiar with PHP, here we have a repository that has pretty representative structure that you can do this in different ways. A bin directory where your binaries go, which is sometimes a misnomer because the files in that directory aren't necessarily themselves compiled these days, as binary would imply, zeros and ones, but that tends to mean where your executables are, any scripts or such. Source, SRC of course, is where people tend to keep their source files, their source code, things that are actually core to the application in Wind. Tests, of course, is where you might put some test scripts, and then there's some other files in here. Git ignore, if you're unfamiliar, that's a file you can maintain in a Git repository to tell Git what files not to push to some service like github.com, things like dot files or config files or personal files that you don't want to accidentally get caught up in version control. Composer.json is a standard within the PHP community whereby you can specify what packages you want this application to depend on, and using the composer command can you pull those dependencies down, just like, with pip or with gem. Can you do that in Python and Ruby respectively? PHP unit.xml is a common file for configuring your unit test, so to speak, your actual test code. And to-do.txt sounds like Michael Paul's to-do list to himself here, though it looks like he's concluded this particular project some years ago, in fact. So where to begin? The most interesting file at the top level of this repo looks like it would be robofile.php because there's no readme. So unfortunately, we're going into this kind of blind. So let's see what robofile.php looks like here. So here we have project's console commands configuration for the robo task runner. And we'll see some syntax that you might not be familiar with. You might know about classes from Python. PHP has classes as well. C does not. C++ does. You'll see that this extends a package, really, or a namespace, starting with robo. And the class name therein is called tasks. Kind of a weird syntax introduced a few years ago to PHP, but it's their equivalent, really, to Python packages, where you use that dot notation, or Java packages that gives you the dot notation as well. Let me scroll down here and provide some feedback now on the code. If you're familiar with C, you might recall this arrow operator is like the dereference operator in C. In PHP, it's not technically that, but it's similar in spirit. It means go inside of some object and call some function or method, or go inside some object and get out some data. It looks here that Michael's using this to actually call a number of methods inside of this robo-file class, or the task class that he's extending. So stop on fail is one method, task PHP unit, tokenizer test, parser test, compiler test. This is perhaps a matter of style and preference. I personally find it a bit strange to put your chained method call on a separate line. It looks like run is simply being called on whatever the return value is of this method, task PHP unit. So this isn't wrong. It will still run, no pun intended. But it just feels like this line of code is so short already. I personally would probably pull it up onto the same line so that I can just read things left to right, top to bottom. But again, to each his or her own here. Let's scroll down here. Interesting that we seem to have the comments are switching between what I gather is probably Spanish and English. That's okay. I would probably be consistent using one or the other. It doesn't really matter which, depending on who your user base is. Same comments here about run sort of unnecessarily being on a line of its own. But it looks like we just have a whole bunch of functions here ultimately that are testing the code that we're about to dive into. So we'll see that soon as well. In here, this is fine too. This is in PHP using the dot operator, which allows you to concatenate one string with another. Lines like this are pretty common in PHP. I personally find it a little hard to read and might prefer to use variable interpolation, whereby you actually use double quotes around your string, and you actually have your $ variable inside of that double quoted string, and it will just get interpolated, so to speak. That is, replaced with the actual value. Of course, Michael seems to be using a function call here, and you can't do that trick in quite the same way, but that's fine as well. It's just a different approach. Just kind of hard to read the format, I think, when it's broken out a little bit like this. So this makes me a little nervous, and we'd have to look at the code more closely to see if this is indeed a problem. But it looks like this code is execing, so maybe that's actually executing a process called tokenizer.php, a PHP script in the bin directory, and then another shell script, it seems, called textcomparer.sh. It's a little weird, it seems, to use one PHP file to execute another PHP file, as opposed to calling functions defined in it. But it's a little too soon to have judgment until we've actually seen these files. But generally speaking, executing or executing other files, you want to be careful of, because you have less control over of what code's getting executed if, again, you're saying execute this whole file as well. All right, so let's take a look a little further. It looks like more test-related code specific to the framework. So let's go back and dive into that bin directory. In the bin directory, we'll see a few different things. Here's that tokenizer. So let's take a look at this. A tokenizer is typically a program that chops up a stream of text into what are called tokens, which might be individual letters or words or sort of meaningful grammatical units. You might tokenize an English sentence into your individual words, for instance, but in programming we of course have so many more symbols. So tokenize means to return to you one at a time all of the interesting chunks that are inside of your code that might be one or more characters. All right, so let's see what we've got going on here. We see some very common PHP conventions. This is used by Composer to auto-load library files that you might want to use. Nice use of class here, presumably a Jack tokenizer, which we'd have to look at in another file, namely in this namespace here. Here we seem to have some pretty clean code, except for the fact I'm not seeing a single comment. And frankly, this file is long enough that I think this would probably benefit from a bit of explanation, but otherwise it looks clean at first glance. Let's go back and maybe look at Jack compiler, which sounds like it's the guts of the program. Jack compiler here, let's see. This looks like it's a command line program. We're seeing the usage information here, which is good. PHP end of line, this is nice because it's making it a little more resilient against platform. So instead of just hard coding \n or \r or \r\n, which are different conventions on Linux and on Mac OS and on Windows, you're asking PHP, use the PHP end of line character, so you don't even have to think about that. And now scrolling down to, again, very nice code, and it's not terribly long, but honestly, at least for someone coming into this cold like I am, some comments I think would certainly help us explain what's going on, so we don't just have to waste time actually figuring everything out. Let's take another quick look, maybe in the source directory here. And here is the essence of the program, though I'm a little intrigued to see another jacktokenizer.php. I wonder if one of those really should have been with the other. I'm not sure. So let's take a look at main.php, right? Because in the absence of not knowing where to look for some familiar phrases, index.html, main.php, or anything suggesting that this is an entry point. So I'll go ahead and dive into main.php. All right. Here we have some unit test question mark, maybe a bit of a to-do there. Here we have a class called main. And you'll see now, especially if you're unfamiliar with PHP, just hints of some of the features of PHP. The ability to define some kind of variable inside of the class that's protected, which has to do with its visibility, whether it's public or private or somewhere in between protected here. You'll see this convention of __ construct, which is PHP's approach to a constructor function. You might recall the init method in Python, which is very similar in spirit, or the constructors that C++ and other languages have. Scrolling down here, would definitely love some comments, but I think we could infer from this what's going on. Although I see, oh, this might be Portuguese instead, perhaps. Looks like our exceptions are alternating between English and now Portuguese, so just as we saw with the comments earlier. So let's see if we can't wrap our mind around this. So again, I think it's just thematic. Like I'm finding the code to be pretty clean overall. That helps, of course, that I know a bit of PHP. But I think definitely some commenting at this point as well. So rather than go through every single file, because I'm not sure we're finding particularly troubling trends or anything like that, why don't we give this one a good thumbs up? And Colton, if you wouldn't mind sharing it in the chat if we haven't already. Shall we take a look at something completely different? And again, along the way, feel free to ask questions or ask me to pause or slow down on any of these files or code as well. All right, so next up, we have an example of a game written in Python implementing a deck of cards. In fact, let me take a look at our description here. Give me just one moment. Our deck of cards. This is a simple Python script that builds, shuffles, and prints a deck of cards such that it is ready for expansion into a simple card game. The focus here is on clean, clear style. Martin Jane, welcome to the stream as well. His main questions for us here today are, how is the formatting style? Can it be wrapped into a class with some methods for use as a module? Are there neater, more concise ways to structure the deck data? Are my naming conventions acceptable? So let's see if we can pluck up at least a few of those as we take a look. Our volunteer here tonight does give a disclaimer. Note, this was made just for fun. He was curious to see if he could. He's pretty new to this, and that's fine too. If you're proposing and submitting your code to me or to Colton or to any of the team here, you don't need to disclaim that you're new to this. We expect as much. So we're happy to help however we can. And again, as always, take our own thoughts with a grain of salt. The True Kinese asks, is it good practice to have at least one comment at the beginning of a file describing what it does, no matter the file program length? I would say probably. I'm not going to say yes to absolutely everything, especially if it's a configuration file or something that's rather self-explanatory. But yes, I think, at least certainly if you're making your code open source, if you're sharing it with a colleague or a friend, if you're submitting it to a course for a teacher to review, I mean, anything that helps the human focus on the interesting work that you did without having to wrap their mind around what was the problem you were even solving, just tell them so that they can actually think harder about the code and not about the overarching goal of that code. All right, so let's take a look at this. Let me go over to our repo here for deckofcards.py. And here we have what's called a gist on GitHub. This is sort of a temporary file that you can create and share independent of repository, but that has a bunch of other features as well, like commenting and revisions as well. So here we go. Deckofcards.py. I see a couple of imports at the top of the file. That's great. That's where they typically belong, giving me access to the random library and the time library, or modules. Here I seem to be getting the local time and storing it in system time date and then iterating over this system time date structure in order to get at various fields. So I think a few comments here. It looks like we're setting ourselves up to use what's called a pseudo-random number generator, some function that's going to give us random numbers again and again and again and again using some uniform distribution of values between typically some lower bound and some upper bound. I say it's pseudo-random though because if you've taken CS50 or some other class or read up on pseudo-random numbers, you'll know that computers can't really be random, right? They can be programmed to do what you say, but they can't be programmed to just think of a number off the top of their head like we humans can. So you actually have to write a program to generate random numbers, and the way you do that is by writing code that takes as input at least one kind of seed, initial default value. Very often that seed is like the current time, not in terms of hours or minutes, but probably in terms of seconds or milliseconds or microseconds or something along those lines, because why? Time is always changing. So in this way, if you're running this deck of cards program or file and now, or in 5 minutes, or tomorrow, that time value will be different. And so the pattern of numbers your pseudo-random number generator will generate will be, hopefully, different based on when you run the program. So therefore it gives sort of the illusion of randomness, or at least an approximation of a distribution of values that would otherwise be perceived as random. But that invites the question, what seed do you choose? If you choose the same seed, like 0, or 1, or 42, or 50, or anything else, and you generate random numbers thereafter, you're going to get the same random or pseudo-random numbers again and again and again because they all start with the same seed. So you want the seed to change, and what I see our volunteer here doing is kind of implementing his or her own seed value, and long story short, just not necessary. I'm guessing this code was inspired maybe by a tutorial or a post online because there's some interesting mathematics going on here, but this is the kind of thing generally in computer science and in programming that you don't want to reinvent yourself unless you're feeling very comfortable and you want to solve some problem that someone else hasn't. Much better, much safer to use libraries out there where lots of other smart people and an open source community ideally has all weighed in visually on the code and said, yes, this code looks correct, rather than reinventing these heuristics ourselves. So long story short, none of this is probably necessary. Actually, even this, none of this is actually necessary beyond getting the local time if we need it, because the random library in Python, the random package, actually provides you with the ability to seed it for you. So if I Google Python random, and then let's type in, let's just do that, see what results we get. Random, random, random. I want to get to the version 3 of Python, so here we go. Generate pseudo-random numbers, and you'll actually see if you read through this that random does come with a seed function, that if you emit the value, it's going to use the current system time. And if we really dived into the documentation, you can see that Python has a secrets module where if you really care about certain cryptographic properties of randomness, there's other code that other people have written. So long story short, when it comes to implementing certain primitives, especially related to randomness or cryptography, generally speaking, I would rely on existing libraries rather than reinventing that wheel yourself. All right, well, let's dive into some of the actual code here and see what it is we're looking at. So this is a program somehow related to cards, and if you're familiar with the deck of cards, they have spades, diamond, clubs, and hearts. Those are the different pictures that are on each of the cards. Here we have a nice utilization of Unicode. These characters do actually exist in Unicode, so even though you might not think you can do this, you can actually have Unicode characters in your code these days, assuming your interpreter or compiler supports it, which it should these days. You can even have emojis, but that's a whole can of worms that we won't open today. Here we see another list in Python declaring all of the values that cards can have on. A for ace, then 2, 3, 4, all the way through 10, then jack, then queen, then king. So these represent all of the numbers or the values that a card might have. And then down here, it looks like we're getting ready to have some counters, T suites and T values, which are respectively the number of suits and the number of values. I'm guessing this was used here so that you don't have to ask the length function again and again how long something is. It's a minor optimization. It's fine to store that value in a variable, but it's pretty efficient to ask a list in Python what its length is. So I wouldn't fret too much about that. Great comments here throughout, and I'll leave it to you to read through them if you'd like. Colton has kindly pasted as our CS50 TV account the URL of this project if you'd like to follow along. Here we see some creation of some tuples, it looks like, inside of a list, some kind of array or matrix via which we can actually compare cards and their values. And then I see the placeholders for a couple of more lists, deck print and deck combined and deck shuffled. The comments are pretty detailed here. It looks like our volunteer is going to populate each of these lists with things like the values of the cards or the human-friendly versions of the cards, the human pronounceable versions. So this seems to be preemptive. And indeed, here we go. We have a bunch of loops now to build a pretty deck. And by that, I take it to mean that there's going to be strings inside of these lists, like such and such a suit with this such and such value. So more of a human-friendly English-like description of that card as opposed to just a or two or three or so forth. Here, though, is an opportunity, I think, stylistically, or even design-wise, to factor this out. It seems a little weird that we're still in the confines of this main program. We've created a couple of lists. Now we have the code to fill those lists. It feels like this is a nice opportunity for abstraction. Give me a function that returns a list with all of these values, or do it in maybe a class, as our volunteer, him or herself, asked in the submission of this actual code. Just feels like we could clean this up rather than just doing everything from top to bottom, because these are pretty distinct operations. All right, so let me scroll down a little further. Here's where the deck of cards is actually getting shuffled, and here's one helper function. It looks like print deck is going to be a function that prints the entire deck in its shuffled order. And so here we see some pretty fancy utilization of iteration, going ahead and printing out the deck of cards itself. But that alone, at least, is good encapsulation, although ironically, after going through all of this top-level code and then introducing one method here, printDeck, we're just calling it immediately, which suggests we didn't necessarily even need to define this function. But I think, as our volunteer noted, if this file is meant to be used as a component for some other card-playing game, then you'll probably want printDeck to exist, but you probably don't want to be calling the printDeck function in case someone imports this function, as with the import keyword in Python, because the function might get called accidentally. Good to see some familiar names, just to catch up on the stream here. Andre, nice to see you, and Bella as well, and AES Sadaji, nice to see everyone as well. And I see a question that just scrolled off my screen. Let me scroll back up here. Are the comments too detailed, or is that possible? I.e., should we worry about over-commenting, asks the Mr. Distinguished. That's a very valid concern. I don't think we've crossed that line with these comments. I think the fact that most of these comments are 1 or maybe 5 or so lines maximally is still pretty readable. If it became unreasonable, well, frankly, that's an opportunity, again, to factor some of the code out and put it in a function, and then document the heck out of that function, right? You really can't go wrong documenting your functions, explaining what your inputs are, what their outputs are, how you use them, any corner cases to be mindful of, any exceptions that might be thrown. So if you were to factor this out into separate functions to generate the shuffled deck and these human-friendly strings, frankly, you could comment even more, I would say. I think the risk that you're identifying is that when all of your code is together, like it is in this one file at the moment, those comments just push and push and push the code down and down and down. So you end up having more comments than code, and it's just a little harder to wrap your mind around it. It's hard to distinguish the code among the comments. So there's some inflection point there. So yes, worry about over-commenting if it's in line with everything else. At that point, you should probably be factoring things out into functions and documenting things a little more modularly. Might be some helpful advice there. All right. Gersimar03, nice to meet you in the stream here. Glad you got to hear about CS50 through NOS Daily. Nusir is actually a former student of mine in CS50 in another course here at Harvard called CS164, software engineering course, and he certainly, with his whole team, has gone off to do some amazing things, including visiting campus that one day and reminiscing with us about his time here on campus. So DMSMTP, hi from India, 1 a.m. Here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, USA, it's about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. All right, I think that leaves us with one more program to dive into here. Let's take a look at what we've got in the form of this Reddit wallpaper bot. We'll go ahead and paste the link to this in the chat if you'd like to follow along. Some of you might, like me, spend a little too much time on Reddit, reading or writing. In this case here, we have a submission that's going to do the following. Let me go ahead and read its formal description and pull this up here on my screen. So in this case here, we have a Reddit scraper that sets the background image based on what's trending on Reddit. So this sounds like a really cool use of an API, dynamic in that it's going to change over time based on what's indeed trending on Reddit. So let's go ahead and take a look at the actual repository that we have here. So this is from Candile4411. Thank you for this submission as well. So here we have a README, which is wonderfully detailed. This is a great example of helping your users get on board, which is really quite cool. Reddit Paper Wallbot says what it is, a bot for Reddit that gets top hot sorted picture from a given subreddit and sets it as the background. This will work, looks like on Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. Prerequisites, you need Python 3.6 installed, which is actually helpful. Those of you familiar with Python in recent years know that it's been evolving. Newer versions have newer features, and if you write code that assume those features, your Python code won't work on older versions. So helping people to know what version you want, if not the latest, is quite helpful to ensure that people can actually engage with your code and use it as well. All right, let's take a look here. Here's some installation instructions. So if you'd like to play along at home, you're welcome to follow these instructions here. It looks like you'll need a Reddit API key, essentially, a client ID and client secret, so that this code can masquerade as you. Let me caution that you should not just go using any old code on the internet, including code that we're taking a look at here, because these are live repositories. They can change over time. And not to impugn any of our kind volunteers today, but you should always be, as we discuss in CS50, a little bit skeptical of any code someone's just put on the internet or encouraging you to run. You probably want to at least skim through it and make sure it seems to do what it says and doesn't have any scary removals or email spams or something like that. So again, just always beware, whether it's with our examples or anything you find on the internet, that you shouldn't just trust something just because it's free. Indeed, it can be doing any number of things. So let's take a look here. I'm not going to go ahead and install this on this particular machine because we'll focus, of course, in the code review on the code itself. But I'm going to go ahead and scroll back up to the repository, and we'll see a different structure from before, but where should my mind wander? So git ignore is git specific and keeps files in or out of the repository. License file is a convention on GitHub that allows you to communicate in a standard way what open source library, if any, you're providing your code with. Pip file here pertains presumably to pip and any requirements that we might have for this particular project. The README, of course, is a GitHub thing here. And then we have bot.py, main.py, and requirements.txt, the last of which is also particular to pip and any dependencies you might want to have. So I'm a little torn. I kind of want to look at the bot, but I kind of want to look at main. So let's look at main first, because that's probably my entry point here. So here we go. This seems to be a command line program that's going to actually kickstart this bot, as best I can tell. I like this, some very clean imports at the top here, an additional import that is probably included in our requirements.txt, separated from the ones that presumably come with Python. Bot, meanwhile, is separated by a white space to make a little more clear that it's not like the others. It's indeed in the same directory, a module called bot.py. So let's keep scrolling down here. Looks like there's some kind of configuration going on here. No comments, but I can perhaps glean from these function names. Love the ASCII art down here. It looks like when this main function is called, we're actually going to see wallpaper bot on the screen, which is nice and fun. And then down here, it looks like there's some kind of configuration being opened. I'm actually being prompted, it seems, for the subreddit or the category or the bulletin board on Reddit, if unfamiliar, that you want to access. It looks like here now, we're using this bot library to actually get a subreddit. Which one? Well, the one that's being passed in along with its name here. It looks like there's some kind of API call here that's going to get the picture post based on hotness, sorting by hot, like what are the most people looking at, upvoting, clicking on, and so forth. This looks to be maybe just for the human's benefit to print out the title and the author of what it is that was discovered. A little progress message here with downloading. Really good use of exceptions here. We don't spend time really in CS50 these days on exceptions, but it's another approach to handling problems in code. In C, you might recall that we tend to return values, special values. Maybe you return a negative value in cases of error, or EOF, or null, or something like that, depending on the function. Well, the tricky part there is that if bunches of things can go wrong, it's hard to know what went wrong if you can only return a value. And it's a little annoying to have to look it up in a chart like with numeric codes. So Python and PHP and other languages, Ruby and C++ and Java have exceptions. Exceptions are a way of just giving up in the middle of a chunk of code, but with useful information saying this type of error happened. So for instance, Python's requests library, which does HTTP requests over the internet, getting more information from some website, allows us in this case to try to get the picture URL in question here. But if something goes wrong, it can raise an exception for the status. If it's not a 200 status code, maybe it's a 400 something or a 500 something, this will throw an exception, and that exception could be a request exception specific to this library. And if that exception occurs, notice how our volunteer here has handled that exception well. And frankly, Python doesn't make this super easy. It tends not to be wonderfully clearly documented as to what exceptions can be thrown by functions. Unfortunately, you kind of know sometimes only after the exception has happened, unless you really dig into the documentation and references online. But this is a great approach to handling exceptions and being proactive about it. Welcome to bits per sec, as well as our other recent subscribers. Glad to have you here on the stream. So yes, Bavik Knight notes that David has a PhD in something like bots. This is going to be interesting. This is a different type of bot. David studied botnets, which were clusters of malicious software triggered by viruses or worms on PCs that collectively take over people's computers, otherwise known as botnets. This bot seems to be a bot specific to Reddit. It's more of a robot or a program that has been written for good purposes, not evil. But thank you, though, for the shout out. Indeed, M. Kloppenberg notes, very different type of bots. So let's go see this bot.py. I'm very interested to see how this is all working. So in bot.py here, we seem to have a class called botException, which indeed, per the comment there, describes what might be thrown when or raised when something wrong happens. GetReddit, I seem to have a function here that uses my login in the form of my client ID and secret, namely those things you can sign up for per the README that we glanced at a moment ago. Notice another good use of exceptions, things that can go wrong here. It seems that this underlying client, praw.reddit, the library that we're using to actually connect to Reddit's backend can throw certain exceptions, client exceptions, so we're catching those as well. So really good error handling. Otherwise, the user might actually see errors if this weren't caught in this way. Get subreddit. Looks like this is a way of using the module or the library to actually go get information about a specific Reddit given its name, just as we see right here. Unfortunately, things can go wrong here, and apparently a type error is thrown in the event you pass in an invalid name. How do we know that? I'm just inferring from the code here, but this library is probably documented somewhere, so we would know that as well. And let's scroll down here, get picture post. I really like the organization of this code because it's very hierarchical or chronological. We're getting a Reddit, we're getting the Reddit, logging in with my credentials, I'm getting a specific subreddit, and now I'm getting the picture posted that represents what's hot in that subreddit. So here too, we're flipping over or iterating over, it looks like the subreddit, having sorted earlier by what's hot, I believe. We're looking for the actual image in question. And you hear my voice slowing down because now this is the first time in this whole code base where I'm really starting to try to figure this out. I would really love one or more comments here, especially to help me understand when maybe each of these errors might happen. Although I do see a comment or so here, oh, we were doing so well up until that point. I do think I certainly would benefit from a little bit of explanation as to what's going on here, just because even though I could figure it out, it's going to take me so much time to just read through every individual line when at this point in the story, I really am just trying to get a sense of things. But code-wise, everything's very nicely cleaned. Notice that this is a very clean approach to writing an if condition that actually has multiple sentiments. This I could go either way on. I noticed that you've put the and keywords at the beginnings of the sentence. It might be a little cleaner to move those to the end of the previous line. This way, each of the 3 Boolean expressions you're asking all line up on the left. But that's a very nitpicky point. I could be convinced certainly otherwise. And if we keep scrolling down, it looks like we have another function here, also nicely chronological, that's presumably going to save the image at a particular path on like the hard drive or the local folder that I'm running in. Great use of error checking here, file exists error, OS error, So it looks like either maybe all of these errors were encountered at some point and these lines of code were added afterward to catch those errors, or very defensive programming, and both of those are good outcomes as well. Indeed, Colton has kindly pasted the URL of a YouTube link to episode 0 of a podcast, an audio-only discussion he and I recently had. We'll be starting that off looking at trends and current events and helping folks to not only understand what's going on, but also to consider the implications of various things. So in our first podcast, for instance, you'll find that we looked at plain text passwords that should not have been, as well as robocalls, which are unfortunately a very abusive approach to software, because it's all too easy these days via APIs to make phone calls. So feel free to check that out as well. You're of course tuned in live right now via Twitch and Facebook and YouTube to our code review stream, which of course has a video component to it, and that's so that we can actually show you code and actually provide some thoughts on it with the whole community here. So another alternative, Userman2 proposes, to the exceptions would be to have guard or exit condition before you try to actually do something with the file system. Absolutely, and I think my only response there is that people in the Python community tend instead not to check for things first and then respond to those error conditions. It tends to be a little more Pythonic to literally try to do something, the operative word being try, and then catch any exceptions, as with the except keyword, if something goes awry. I'm not sure if one way is necessarily better than the other. It's just sort of a different mindset, except arguably with Python, you're at least ensuring that state can't change in between those error checks. If you were to have an if condition and then error out if something is wrong, it's possible in certain environments, especially multi-threaded applications or whatnot, that the state could change that you've checked, in which case you shouldn't blindly forge ahead. So I could be convinced either way, but in the Python world, trying things and awaiting exceptions tends to be a very common approach, but there are absolutely others as well. All right, so let's take a look finally at this code here, creating an image. So some helpful comments throughout. I see setting background image actually happens below. Looks like a nice use of UX, so prompting the user if he or she actually wants to set the picture as the background rather than just blindly doing it. So again, just beware if you're going to be using this code on your computer, this could indeed be affecting your own machine, because the whole point is to set a background on Windows or Darwin, aka Mac OS, or Linux. So realize that running this code on your machine, even by following the README, might have effects that you don't intend. So just do beware anytime you're using open source code like this here, no matter how well it's actually written. Welcome to MIBAC138, who's just joined us here as well. And now we see finally some implementation specific details. And this is a really good use of abstraction, I would say, in that we have this higher level function, set image background, but that actually then uses one of these following implementation specific functions for Windows or Mac OS or Linux. Notice that for Windows, there's apparently this crazy module buried in this package inside of Python that allows you to set the wallpaper using what seems to be some kind of system call specific to the operating system. Down here, Mac OS seems to need some kind of Mac script. So this feels a little hackish in that you have to run this OSA script to tell the application finder to set desktop picture to image path as POSIX file. So it's a wonderfully expressive scripting language, but we need to create that script on the fly and then run it. I've not looked into this myself. I'm guessing that's probably the only way, the best way in Python to do it, but that indeed would be Mac specific. And then down here on Linux, do you have another approach that would actually use get dist script for distribution specific script, it would seem, and then down below that is a whole bunch of conditions that are changing settings based on the version of Linux you're using. So this is a nice abstraction too, because you can support different Linuxes as well. So I see Andre here has asked, where would you draw the line as far as throwing exceptions go? Would you say it's good practice to throw an exception for things like erroneous input from the user, or would that be a bit of an abuse of the concept? Would it be better practice to just make sure the input conditions are met locally within the calling function? Really good question. I think it partly depends on the audience. In CS50, for instance, when we introduce Python, we deliberately don't use exceptions because we only spend so much time on Python, and we want students to be comfortable and experienced handling errors, but not necessarily through a whole new paradigm. And so we've tended to rely on return values and proactive error checking, as someone noted a little bit earlier ago, Userman2, I believe. But it does tend to be, and I think were we to spend more weeks on Python and CS50, and were I to be writing Python code myself, it does tend to be Pythonic to leverage exceptions more heavily. So yes, if the user is prompted for a floating point value, and they provide, or rather, if the user is prompted for an integer and they provide a floating point value or a string, throwing literally a type error, raising a type error would be appropriate there and certainly conventional, but you could absolutely just return false or some other such value. But it does tend to be an exception-centric language, certainly among the standard libraries, so I don't think you'd be abusing it at all in that case. It just changes the approach to programming, but it does ultimately give you a bit more expressiveness. You just end up perhaps writing a little more code in order to catch different types of exceptions, but that's perhaps not a bad thing. So let's scroll back up in a couple of comments here after Andre's. We had here that userman2 notes, one thing I want to point out is using print for a prompt instead of the question in input. Let me find that here. It might have been in our other file, input. So using input here, indeed. So I glossed over that earlier, and we were using print here instead of the input function, which we could have been using here. Absolutely. I think we could have moved that text to the input call, especially if the human doesn't cooperate and doesn't type Y or N, but maybe type something random instead. You could certainly imagine wanting to reprompt them again and again and again inside of this while loop. So I agree with userman2. I think there's probably an opportunity to clean that up a little bit, or at least take a different approach as well. Vicious Brain writes, is it a good idea to code some extra methods thinking that one may use this in the future? It depends. I think the question there, not unlike Andre's, is where you draw a line. In this case, where do you draw the line between writing something that works now versus something that's going to work better later? You don't want to necessarily get into the habit of over-engineering your code, because what might be a very simple script with a few dozen or a couple hundred lines of code could mushroom into 500 or 1,000 lines because you're trying to provide the kitchen sink, so to speak, to do everything possible that you might want in the future. I think at least in recent years, have been more of the mindset of design your code well, keep in mind features you might want to have in the future, but don't necessarily implement all of those features now. But just be mindful of the implications of having a different function. So for instance, if I were writing a Reddit bot that was only supposed to set the background on Mac OS, frankly, I'm not probably going to bother writing the Windows code or the Linux code if I only care about my own Mac. However, if I do want to open source the code, and I could imagine maybe using a PC down the road or a Linux box or letting other people use this, then maybe just like our volunteer here, Candile4411, I would engineer the code in advance to have these abstractions, setting the background on a generic operating system, implementing only the Mac OS version of that function, but knowing that eventually I or someone else could contribute the Windows or the Linux versions instead. So that might be the line. I wouldn't necessarily cut a lot of corners just to get the code done, but design things well, leave placeholders for future features that don't necessarily limit you in the near term. So hope that helps, and just my thoughts, and hopefully a helpful food for thought there. All right, so let's see what else we've got in the chat. Let me just flip through here. Some good chats going on. All right, so I think we are now caught up, and that leads us really kind of to the bottom of the file here. We've got a setting of a Mac background, Windows background, Linux background, and then lastly, we've just got some error handling in terms of exception handling. So I would say overall, this was pretty well written. In fact, I really like how it was, again, top-bottom structured chronologically. This function calls this one, which calls this one. Really didn't make me think. I could focus entirely on the code and the functionality. Some nice comments throughout, even though a few more here and there probably would have helped me at least. And this abstraction of those operating specific features, really well done as well. And honestly, I think of the READMEs we've seen today, this is probably the most solid. We've got sample screenshots. We've highlighted and drawn attention to where those values should be in Reddit's UI. So I would encourage you absolutely to take a look at this in all 4 of today's repos. So our thanks to all of our volunteers. And actually notice this. This is one of the cool things about open source contributions. If you want to not only get better at writing code and getting feedback from the community, you can also get your acknowledgments here. So it looks like Dextraz actually contributed Mac support. So I'm guessing he or she wrote the Mac specific function that was slotted into the bot.py file that we just went ahead and took a look at. So those are the 4 repositories that we thought we'd take a look at today. Feel free to scroll up in the chat if you'd like to see some of those URLs again. As always, head to cs50.ly/code review if you'd like to submit your own code for review, and we're happy to take a look at it. Myself, Colton, CS50's team. By all means, as before, don't worry if you're feeling a little less comfortable or if you're new to programming. That's the whole point here, but we would just ask that you make the code public so that others can certainly follow along on stream with us and maybe even play with the code on their own screens as well. So Puppet4411, I recognize the number. You're very welcome. Really cool program and very well documented and designed. So glad everyone's been able to chime in. So Colton and I will linger here for another minute or two if you have questions, but otherwise, again, Colton's just pasted CS50 TV, cs50.ly/code review. Go ahead at any point during the week and submit some code that you might like us to take a look at there. It can be most any language, though ideally one that he or I know, as well as Brian and other members of CS50's team. But even then, it's been a few years now since I've written any PHP code, but hopefully I made my way through our second example today. Mr. Distinguished, you are quite welcome. Glad you tuned in. Gersmar03, glad you made 2 new friends, the True Kines and the Mr. Distinguished. I'm glad you are socializing. In addition to the Twitch channel here and Facebook and YouTube, there's also CS50's Discourse channel, which has gotten mentioned a few times as well today. And if you go to cs50x.slack.com, is that the CS50 Slack as well. And you can generate an invite by going to cs50.edx.org/Slack, which will automatically invite you to the Slack workspace if you'd like to join us there as well. Paul 2, today, we don't have time to consider today. What we typically do is take a look through everything in advance just to make sure we know what we're diving into, but we'll hopefully hold another one of these in the next week or two. So thank you for submitting, and we'll hope to get to that next time if we may. All right, so thank you so much to Colton, who's been sitting off screen here today and working his magic to make sure everything went so smoothly. Thanks to Bavik Knight and everyone for tuning in. Andrew as well, who helped us get set up with the audio and video. That's it for today's code review. This will be available on demand later if you missed the beginning or would like to go back through some of the code. And again, all of these repos were publicly available. You can read them off of the URL bars and take a look at your own machine. And again, lastly, cs50.ly/code review if you'd like to submit your code as well. That's it, and we'll see you soon.